Welcome to this lecturette on power knowledge. This lecturette will focus on three key questions. What is power? What is knowledge or truth? And what is power knowledge? At its most basic, power is best understood as being able to make someone else behave as you choose. In our everyday understanding of power, as we experience it in our societies, power is the rule by the few over the majority. And the way we approach this power, that if it's been acquired through a political process, it is considered a legitimate power, and if it's not acquired through a political process, we tend to view it as illegitimate and coercive. Max Weber talks about power as being the probability that one actor within a social relationships will be in a position to carry out his will despite resistance, regardless of the basis on which this probability rests. What he's saying is that power is basically when a person can behave as they choose, regardless of what is being done to them in terms of trying to stop them from doing so. Giddens talks about power in a slightly different way. He talks about power as the ability of individuals or groups to make their own concerns or interests count, even where others resist. So here he looks at power and he's starting to include the idea of groups, where you're pushing your interests and what you think is important over what the rest of society or other people around you might consider that. He goes on to talk about how sometimes power would involve the direct use of force, but that's not enough. You always have to accompany with the development of ideas or an ideology, a dominant way of thinking, which then you can use to justify the actions. So here he's bringing different elements in. He's talking about being able to push your or your group's interests forward, and not only that, but to then accompany it with a dominant way of thinking that would then make your ideas or your actions justifiable. Now, there's many different types of power. Galbraith talks about three types of power. He talks about compensatory power, in which submission is bought, so you're trying to buy the ability to get things done. He talks about condign power, in which you convince people to behave in the way that you want them by making not doing what you want them painful or regretful, which is always unpleasant. And finally, conditioned power, in which submission is gained by persuasion. So over time, you've persuaded people that the way they should behave is the right way to behave. Now, Weber talks about different types of power. So he talks about coercion, he talks about charismatic power, he talks about traditional power, and he talks about legal rational power. These are just four types of power. There's many different types of power. Other writers have talked about hard and soft power, legitimate power, the power of the expert, the reverent power, as well as things that we are more familiar with every day, such as celebrity power. For us, what we're going to look at is really the ideas of power put forward by Michel Foucault. He talks interestingly that power is not just a negative or coercive thing that forces behavior, but that power is also a productive and positive force. Now, this changes our traditional understanding of power in such that power is to more impel or compel people to behave the way you want to behave. And here he talks about, well, power can go the other way and actually be used to be productive and positive, and this is something we'll come back to. Now, he talks about power in three key markers. One is that power is everywhere. You cannot escape power, and it comes from everywhere. Everything around you and everyone around you, the institutions and so on, are all engaging in power relations. As such, you cannot escape the way power works. But power is also in constant flux, so it's constantly being contested and negotiated between the different entities and bodies and people out there. In order to make that work, we must understand its power not being concentrated in a few places, but rather diffused and spread among a larger set of actors. He talks as power as not just something that you have, but rather that something that is embodied and enacted. And that is really an interesting way to think about power. He talks of power as not just being primarily about coercion, which is compelling or forcing people to behave, but rather also looking at power in discursive spaces where knowledge is housed. And interestingly, he talks about power as being constitutive rather than just something that's being used. In this sense, he means that power is what makes things rather than is exercised by agents by themselves. So in order for this to work, we must understand that power is not a thing, but it's actually a relationship. Power is a relationship that you can have with different entities and objects and institutions around you. It is not just repressive, but can be used for productive aims. And very importantly, power is exercised throughout the social body. So it does not just exist in the higher echelons, but it exists through the system. And then he talks about the idea of micro levels of social relations that also have power operating within them, and that power is present in every level of the social body. So here he's not just looking at power as being embedded in political structures or embedded in economic structures, but he's also saying power exists in social structures, but also when he talks about discourse, power is also embedded in the way we manage and understand knowledge. So Foucault expands the notion of power quite dramatically and starts to include things that perhaps were not traditionally considered when looking at the notions of power. Now, one of the more interesting and useful types of power he talks about is disciplinary power. So here he talks about a mechanism of power that regulates the behavior of individuals in the social body. So how people behave within a social body, such as a group of people, a university, a class, society, a community, and how this is done using the technologies of discipline such as space or time, and how these are then used to impact on people's activity and behavior. So in his book Discipline and Punish, Foucault talks particularly about the development of the prison system and its relationship to such as the education system, and how the spaces themselves create relationships of power. And that's one of the key interesting things that he has developed. This disciplinary power is enforced with complex systems of surveillance. So there's power exerted in the surveillance system in the sense that you learn from what's being you learn through observation and through when power exists in different types of situations, which you then eventually internalize. He talks about this in great detail using the panopticon as a great model.